Hello and welcome to the Womb-Centered Healing Podcast. I'm Jessica Huckabee and I have Desiree with me here today. Thank you so much for joining us, Desiree. I met Desiree on TikTok, actually. I've been, for those of you who don't know this, I started a TikTok channel and I've been following more and more. I do more following than creating on TikTok these days. There's so many awesome creators on TikTok, and Desiree is one of them. And I was really inspired by one of Desiree's TikTok videos talking about ancestral healing and the importance of people with European heritage, particularly, to get in touch with and do some healing work around that European heritage, because there is a lot of pain there, unaddressed pain, a lot of we might have a lot of guilt and shame around some of the things that our European ancestors may have done. There may be a mixture of ancestry that has been at war and doing horrible things to each other in our background. And there have been, colonization of our European ancestors that needs to be healed and undone, and reclamation of more indigenous earth-based spirituality in our European ancestry, that there's a deep hunger there that needs to be fulfilled. And if we don't fulfill it in that avenue, then we end up fulfilling it in ways that perpetuate colonization practices like cultural appropriation. So I said a lot of things. I want to hand it over to Desiree, because you were saying about these similar things so eloquently and so potently on TikTok. And I would love for you to share some of your perspectives about that and introduce this topic as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jessica, for having me. My name is Desiree B. Stevens. I do decolonization coaching and I do spiritual counseling. And on the TikTok that you were talking about specifically, I was talking about why ancestral healing is necessary for white people. Because for me, I separate like a fair skin, like the white skin, what we would phenotypically place into the group. And I consider it a system, because whiteness was created for an economic system, a delineation, in fact. And when you escape into that system, that is exactly what it is, like what you mentioned, right? It's not dealing with stuff from your past, your cultural ties, your epigenetic pain, all of that. All of that generational trauma that gets passed on. And speaking of, you do womb healing, those carry on, right? Like your matrilineal line from womb to womb to womb to womb, those traumas are passed on. When white people don't take the time to get okay and settle in with themselves, okay, what happened to me? Who were my people, right? Well, how did I become white? Like, even if they're looking to begin, like, I've often asked that in my group spaces, like, when did your family become white? Because it is literally that arbitrary, right? Like, you'll find it, like, certain groups that were never considered white are now considered white because it's a political number that's needed in order to maintain control. When you begin to release that and you start getting into the history of who you were, everyone is indigenous to somewhere, right? We're not indigenous. This is not a claim to make, a claim to being indigenous to America. Being indigenous to a land is also a womb healing thing, right? Like, you're from this land. Your people came from that land, tilled that soil, planted flowers, trees, right? Like, all of this magic that you often find in the spiritual community of, like, let's buy crystals and find and seeking, right? I see all of this seeking for the healing, right? Like, oh, we're gonna do spell works, we're Wiccans, we're neo-pagans. So I became acutely aware that they were seeking healing, right? And coming from my background, I'm Irish and I'm Black American. So I've always had an identity of being Irish, right? Like, my mother told me she was Irish. Like it just was like my grandmother was from Ireland. This is not like I'm Irish from the 1700s back. My mother's first generation American. So my ties to the culture grounded me in a very real way, where in a country, when you're dealing with race, something gets erased because whiteness is about purity, right? You don't get to be, I show up in the world phenotypically Black, right? Because I have melanation, phenotypes, whatever may be that range of that delineation, it always means not white, because white requires purity for its numbers. It's a very weird system that can cause a lot of dissonance because it never fully makes sense, which causes a ton of disruption in the body and in the process of healing. So me noticing that they were seeking healing, I'm like, okay, get straight to your ancestral healing. Then you won't step out appropriating cultures, right? Like you're not going to try to, I'm going to practice voodoo, I'm going to practice hoodoo, I'm going to go to powwows. You don't need to do any of that. You need to heal your ancestral line. You need to get okay with things that have happened. You need to release shame. You need to release guilt. You need to take accountability and reclaim who you were and separate from the system of whiteness. And that for me is the crux of ancestral healing, specifically when it comes to white people here in America.
Absolutely. And I can speak from personal experience as an Italian American in one aspect of my heritage. That Italians for a long time were not considered white
At all.
at all. And deliberately, and there were actual ceremonies where they would construct a physical large melting pot, it was called. And they would do these melting pot ceremonies where you would come with your, mostly the men would come with their more Italian clothing and any objects that represented their Italian heritage. And they would get into these melting pots and change into a suit and tie and leave all of their Italian heritage objects in the melting pot and come out as white.
Wow.
And
how symbolic is that, viewing that? Because that's what it is, right? I put things in visual perspectives too.
Yep.
And like when I think about it, right, because we used to have media in a different way. I'm 42 years old. So like the internet and stuff. I grew up with newspapers and, you know, like political cartoons and the Sunday funnies. So I still register things in that
Right.
sort of way, right?
Mhm.
So I could totally see that. And that would be a great like media ad, right, to be portrayed, like, because that's what it does. Because what I see is like when you like enter the gates of America, like I see like two big bags of luggage with all of your heritage. Leave your language, leave your culture, leave your food unless we can exploit it, leave your practices, right? Because there's a very strong folk magic within Italian, you know, across Italy, not as one, but folk magic as wise. Leave all of those things in those bags. Change your name. Many people who are now white were forced to do all of this assimilation. You know, name changes, nose jobs. That was a big thing in a certain community as well, right? As much as you can assimilate into being Anglo-Saxon for the protection of whiteness, and that's trauma. And until that trauma is dealt with, it passes on specifically in the womb, right? In that space where it's meant to be safe to be brought into this new world. It's actually a violent place to start out because it's unsure of what am I, who am I, right? And like people are practicing in silence, right? Like people are hiding their languages at that time specifically until it's just become homogenized.
Well, and
Now everybody looks like that. I'm sorry.
right. And no, I'm sorry. I thought you had come to a pause. But yeah, now everybody looks like that. And my big question that I contemplate and talk about a lot actually is why? why was this system invented? And now you've hinted at it in some of the things that you've said, and because it's economics, it's the wealthy elite wanting to create an exploitable class of people and wanting to enlist, and create a culture that makes people more exploitable, and where some people, the people that are striving to attain this idealized, purified version of whiteness, are doing so in order to attain membership in the elite economic class.
Correct.
And in doing so, in that striving to attain that, they are losing all kinds of things that connect them to the land and make them more difficult to exploit, like festivals and ceremonies that last days and days and days, where nobody wants to work and everybody's just having a good time, feeling human and all of that. That in order to attain membership in the elite class, the promise of attaining membership, you got to leave all of those things behind, making yourself more exploitable by the elite, not necessarily paving your way to become the elite.
No,
because the elite is just that, it's elite. There's only 1% of the population that can ever be there. Because there's not enough, having that embarrassment of luxurious wealth hoarded, not everyone can do that. We deplete the planet.
no.
We deplete
You would
it.
actually, and it requires, what people don't really understand about the system of capitalism is it actually requires an underclass.
Yes.
Right, like, and we're seeing that now, right? Because I think that what happened is that it kind of crept on slowly, and I wouldn't even say slowly, because this country is so young, and most countries develop over like thousands and thousands of years. But for written history, because history has been written by colonizers. Before that, these were tales that were passed down from our elders, right? Like, these people, whomever they are, from wherever they came, they existed way before colonizers entered the world. But because colonizers annotated this, they get to tell the story. So we often see things as if the world's history just began from where it was annotated. Right? So in this very short span of time, you will see that there were class systems or caste systems, however you want to place it, right? So America specifically replicated, for me, in my opinion, the monarchy. What, you will never be a royal, right? Like, that was not even, you just couldn't get into that, however they created that space, you couldn't get into that. So people became comfortable in their class or in their stations, right? As long as it was just enough. But there was still always that underbelly that was always hungrier, always suffering. And those are the people that everybody above saw as disposable. And those people are the ones that discovered America, right? Because those are the ones that you sent out into the land to go look for spices, because these people were disposable to you. So when they come to a land like that, and then now here comes the higher class making legal formations, right? Because this country is a company. When they start making legal business formations of how this is going to look, those people get back into an underclass, but higher than they were in their home country, right? Higher than they were there. So it's still better off, right? And they're just like, hey, leave me alone. I'm going to tend to my stuff. I'm going to do this. But each level had to be exploited more and more and more. And now we're seeing that, like, fast forwarding with a lot of nuance left out. And now we're seeing where this major gap is, where it always was. It was always smoke and mirrors, right? You have these billionaires, which just is something that should not exist. Like, no one needs that much wealth while people are literally starving. That's my personal opinion. That's definitely the hill I'll die.
I'm with you. I'm with you on that one.
Thank you. And then you have everyone else at this point. And that is actually a replication of how this all started.
Right, the monarchy and all of that.
It was everyone else, like, because you were never going to be that. And when you start getting into that healing, you start dissecting it, why that's important for me, and where I see social justice work meeting spirituality, at least for me, is when we begin to decolonize everything. Why do you think what you think? Because we've all been colonized and socialized into believing certain things. We all are upholding this supremacist system, no matter who you are, in certain ways, right? And when you start unpacking that, unraveling and decolonizing, and I literally tell clients to do this, like this motion, right? Like pull it out, like meditate on it, pull it out. Where did you feel that in your body? Where did that come from? What about this thought? Like take it out of you and you unpack those things and you open yourself up. You start connecting with that underclass in a different way. You disconnect from oppression as your identity, because being a white person is being an oppressor, even of other white people. It's not even, I'm not even making this exclusive, but a white culture is about oppression. And when you separate yourself from that and you get back to your indigenousness, when you get back to like with your womb, your first home, yourself, and the lineage that you come from, this social construct would have to fall apart, because it's a social contract that we agree upon. And once we disagree, it can't stand.
Yeah. You know, it's so true. So many of all the things that you're saying are just really hitting home. And no wonder I really heard what you were saying on your TikTok video and invited you to come on here, because I knew we'd have this kind of conversation. And what it's bringing up for me is that, you know, this process of colonization started happening long before European folk came to the Americas.
Yes.
It started happening with the Romans. And
Yeah.
I talk a lot about, and it happened even before the Romans. I mean, people, you know, if you, a really good, great book, if folks want to learn the archaeological history of this domination-based model of society, where one group of people decides to take more ownership and resources of land and resources and territories by force, by dominating other people in a mass destructive way. A great book to learn about that and what we were doing before that started happening across the board is called The Chalice and the Blade by Rihanna Iceland. Have you read that book?
I have not, but it sounds like something I would like anyway. It sounds very Da Vinci Code-ish.
Yeah, but it's really based in archaeology. So she studied the archaeology of the goddess statues and looking at it through the lens of the women and the culture, that like if a culture was revering the feminine form, what would that mean in their daily life? And if the women were actually revered and revered themselves and were, you know, a central part of life, what would that mean? And what did the archaeology show if you looked at it through that lens? And then she's looked at, in the timeline of archaeology, when and where these mass destructive domination based takeovers started to happen, of genocidal takeovers of certain lands and peoples and like that, and how that established this patriarchal model of society where the biggest bullies, the meanest, most violent people are the ones that gather all the wealth and resources and exploit the lesser able to dominate in a violent way, right? So this domination-based hierarchical model of society was established at a certain point. It wasn't always like that. There were hundreds of thousands of years when we were revering these goddess statues where that kind of thing wasn't happening.
Right.
Theologically speaking, there were no mass violent wars taking over, huge mass, you know, migrations of people taking over and being displaced and all that. That only happened, you know, at a certain point. And then that was happening all over Europe. And one of the central main things that happened was the disruption of the lunar menstrual cycle based calendar.
I
So
love that information. I actually use a lunar cycle for my
yeah,
own personal living, like even my work. Like I have the Ancestral Healing group, which is what I was speaking about there on TikTok. And even that, it's like a 6 month group, but it's based in the lunar cycles,
yes,
right? Like honoring that shedding, honoring, that womb energy for me, right? Because that divine feminine is something for me, and it's not to be exclusionary. This is not like turfy feeling. I don't see it in that sense of way. It's an energy, right? Like that life bringer. And here's what it is like sometimes when you say that, right? Like when it's like you're boiling us down to just our reproductive organs or genitals, right? And I'm like, you don't understand is that they took everything that was something beautiful and they made it so ugly that now we also hate it and we're not reclaiming that, right? I'm not saying there's a superiority. I'm saying just honor that divine feminine
mm-hmm.
and heal that space. Just kind of just like squeeze her in somewhere in your life. And if I could do that in simple things, right? Like a lot of people do astrology and I'm like, here's what the moon says today, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Right.
let's see what mom says because, she kind of just like shifts all the waters on the earth and we're also 70% water. And so I'm just saying,
That's right.
maybe that moon energy is a little bit more accurate than like the masculine sun astrology and energy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then to speak to your archaeological, I'm definitely going to grab that book. And with colonization, is like, and this is my own summation of it, is that when I think of colonization and going back and speaking specifically to tying white people back to their ethnic European identities,
Mm-hmm.
it is the Christianization of it
Yes,
all.
there it is, right there.
That's the first colonization is creating it's insane almost to say it out loud when you unpack and decolonize when you created one nation under God,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
The Romans were so small in their little space in the world in Italy, right? Like they were and they created a vast empire, right? And like you said, through violence and dominion. And I mean, that's some major like you need to look at a map. I want people, if they're listening, to then stop, pause, or whatever, to really look at a map of the Roman Empire. Literally just Google Roman Empire
Mm-hmm.
and see where Rome started as this tiny little blip and how it expanded over countries. That takes some serious violence, some serious, brutality
Mm-hmm.
in order to do that, right? And for me, energetically thinking is just like, okay, they've amassed all of these empires, right? But like, it's really difficult to control Britain and Madagascar, right, under one rule because, like, this is not the internet, right? Where we're FaceTiming the generals and checking in and seeing how that was, right? Like they were like kind of just the Mediterranean Sea became their personal like boat conduit to get to their empires.
Mm-hmm.
And they just kept spreading. And for me, when I think about like religion, spirituality, and like how you look at Christianity and it took over these spaces and erased the divine feminine from it. I'm like, oh, so these are all those intersections and where it ties in, right? Because they saw this dude, right? Like preaching revolutionary stuff, because that's like how I vision Jesus, right? Like when you really pay attention to him outside of religion, he was like anti-government, he's like down for sex workers, he sees everybody as equals, he doesn't preach from a pulpit, he speaks in a Socratic method, he's just talking to the people. Like this is not a good life. This is not okay. These people are ruling over you. Do you not see it? You are meant to be free people. And then they kill him. They create a white savior. They take and absorb all of these people's practices and cultural and belief systems. They quash the woman, right? The divine feminine. They turn her into nothing but like this pure, just this vessel to bring forth more powerful men. And they shift the entire narrative because this is when history is being written, right? Oral tales are dead. We don't know the truth. They're writing the history. They could do whatever. And you can actually unite multiple nations with a theory
Mm-hmm.
of one God.
Yeah.
And that comes, it's the Roman Catholic Church for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
It's still a Roman Empire. You have 40,000 sects of Christianity, one God.
Mm-hmm.
That's weird.
Mm.
That's
Yeah.
odd.
Yeah, it's and it's kind of across the board. But the thing is that I want to pull out, right? Like you were saying, pull out of that
And
story.
may I interrupt you? Sometimes you could pull it out and just let it sit because some
Right.
things aren't ready to be dealt with, right?
Right.
So, like, not saying this time, I'm just saying, like, I'm gonna pull that out. I want it out of me, but I'm not ready to deal. So I'm just gonna sit it right there and I'll get back
Right.
to it.
Yeah. I'm just pulling this out of our collective story around Christianity, being the oppressor. But and you kind of hinted at it when you were talking about the essence of Jesus's teachings, is that many Christians were enslaved initially by the Romans. I mean, the Romans were the ones that killed Jesus, right?
Correct.
And so Christianity was appropriated by the dominating class for dominator class purposes, which was to dominate and amass more wealth for the wealthy elite. And in fact, the actual books in the Bible, you can look up the Gnostic Gospels.
Oh, yes, I use those.
And other things like that. There's other texts that have reclaimed and resurrected works of writing that were written that were by disciples of Jesus that were excluded and claimed to be heretical by those who were trying to appropriate Christianity and this mass growing devotion to the teachings of Jesus. The wealthy elite wanted to appropriate that, but in order to do so, they had a meeting where they said, okay, this book we can have in the Bible.
The Nicene Creed.
Right. And so they put it together with this purpose of enslaving the masses with that social political purpose. So when people claim that the Bible is the word of God come through Jesus or whomever was writing it, we have to recognize that it was actually, even though the original writers may have been having a divine experience and writing the wisdom that came through, different people have different divine experiences with that's influenced by their trauma and whatever their human experience was.
Absolutely.
And so those socio-political leaders who said, okay, we're going to take this person's divine experience and put that in the Bible, but these people over here, no, they are heretics.
Yeah.
For their socio-political purposes of having dominion over the masses.
Absolutely.
Which is the antithesis of Jesus's teachings in the first place. So yes, those books may have been some people's experience of divine wisdom, but they've been usurped and manipulated for this end of domination over the masses. So there, we said it a bunch of different ways. So hopefully.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's because that's really what it comes down to is like, it was still used. The first colonization is actually Christianization. And then when it moved over here to this land, it took even more, right? Because they were so far separated from, right, their people, their original homes, their indigenous lands, and that energetic and magical connection, right? Like, again, I love going back to like that womb metaphor. Like, from that womb, your homeland is it's what birthed you. It's what birthed your lineage, right? We are a part of the earth. My friend of mine, and they also work with me inside of their ancestral group, Shameka, says it really well when they say that you can't own land. Like, we are from the land, right? Like, and even if you want to take it into biblical context, right? Because I'm not trying to exclude people who are Christians. I myself identify as a Christian witch, right? So even if you take it, it's like, when that word says that you are from the dirt, right? Like, breathe life into you, from dirt you were created, to dirt you shall return. That's the earth. That's the universal womb, right? Whatever you plant into that will manifest into something. So when you are stripped and disconnected from your land, right? Because people can move from anywhere. Like, somebody from Argentina can move right now and still hold that cultural tie because they're connected to that land, the people, that culture. But when that culture has been stripped from you or forced off of you for survival and into forced assimilation, there's a disconnect that needs to get back to, right?
Mhm.
It's like the severing of the umbilical cord and ripping from their mother.
Mhm. And it's so great that you say it that way. There's another aspect to it that helps us to see how the womb connection with the ancestral healing connection, because one of the prime, most fundamental ways that severing took place that you just described was through the vilification of the menstrual cycle and the vilification of practices based on the menstrual cycle, the calendar, the lunar menstrual cycle based calendar, claiming
Mm-hmm.
that, the vilification of anything having to do with menstrual blood.
Yes.
So
Making it dirty,
ceremonial,
obscene.
right? And making it dirty, obscene, and vilifying and violently persecuting anyone who did the sacred menstrual practices of offering their blood back to the earth, which is the way that connection to
Yeah.
the earth, to the land, of giving back to the land, was passed down over the generations. And
Yeah.
the wisdom keepers of healing and wellness and life generative practices were involved in those kinds of practices, and those were the ones who were burned at the stake for being witches or harlots or
Absolutely.
whatever. And so
Remembering where they came from. They're
exactly.
remembering their inner, you touched on that, like with the biology of
Mm-hmm.
every cell in your body being a womb. It's that inner knowing. Like, that, right? I was camping recently and I was hoping that I got I was hoping that I got my menstruation cycle. Like, I was like, oh, because I totally red tent. Like, my husband like keeps the kids away. They know I'm like, I'm bleeding. This is my time. I connect. Let me pull some cards. Let me just be one, right? Like, connect with this beautiful cycle of like releasing and rebirthing, releasing and rebirthing. Like, it's a beautiful cycle. And I was hoping, because I was out in the woods and it was like so beautiful. I was like, oh God, I would love to just squat and free bleed and meditate and like connect this one-on-one way. And it didn't happen, unfortunately. I mean, I have a backyard and all that I could do it with, but it was so different in this like first camping experience, and just like being outside and enjoying that connection so much. And society doesn't allow it. It vilified it. And then when you start putting the layers on it, like you said earlier, there's no time anymore.
Mm-hmm.
There's no time. You have to, in order to try to get into that, or at this point, in order to just survive, let alone trying to get into that higher tier, we have no time.
Yeah.
We have no time to get to these practices that are so healing and so necessary.
Well, because the system is designed not to facilitate everyone getting into that
No,
higher tier, because you can't. Only the people at the top of the pyramid can be at the top of the pyramid.
correct.
Not everyone can be there. And so
Yeah,
the system is not designed to facilitate us getting there. It's designed
right.
to make it so that we're all scrambling and working and working and working, trying to get there, only to put more money into the pockets of the people who are already there.
Right. And if we did our ancestral healing, we would remember that and break away from the system, right? Because you'd want to live on the land. You'd want to live at a lesser scale because you recognize that you are connected to the land. Like your wealth would be like I'm like we are homesteaders, we're urban homesteaders, and like so I like I have my okra right now drying out in the window, and I have my snap peas on my altar, thankful, right? Because okra was a crop that was brought over from enslaved Africans. So, like, I thank my ancestors for giving me this crop and putting it into the ground. And these seeds repropagated from those hands, from that land, through this struggle, and still survived. It's not just okra, right? Like it's not like that seed, right? And back to like again, it all comes into the womb. That seed being planted into the earth gives birth to, it says another generation is doing this. It says another generation has not forgotten you. It drying in my window is saying I'm going to harvest those seeds, and this is my wealth because I'm going to pass that down. And my children have seen us gardening, and they will garden hopefully because we're able to still maintain indigenous practices as far as being knowing that we're connected to the earth. Again, this is not about appropriate. I think people often hear indigenous and think only America, but we were all indigenous to land at one point in time. And indigenous practices are just about that, like you said, honoring your cycle, honoring the roles each of us play in society, not based on genitals, not based on weird gender norms, not based on financial capital, right? As a community, all of us together, my children can plant those seeds. That's wealth when you get back to ancestral healing. And I recognize that we need stable housing. I'm not on some like, kumbaya, like live in the woods, oblivious, right? Like I work also. But small ways to get there is scaling down a little bit, right? Like work to just pay off the mortgage in your house. Like you don't need another mortgage or to amass multiple property or generational wealth. Like do it to the point of it's comfortable. Like, right? Like, you know what? I do want to have my home paid off because this is the system that we're living in, right? So I'm going to work to that, right? But then that's going to take other choices too. Do you need a $400,000 house? Do you need it to have X, Y, and Z in it? Can you start small and build on it, right? Maybe get a land with with a trailer on it and build out. And more family can come and live there. You can shift those things and getting into that ancestral healing, at least for me, not saying there aren't other ways, but it's just a way of remembering, getting that information like you were talking about from that inner cell that's within that tells you you could recreate, you could rebuild, you can rebirth because that information is in you. You just have to break away from the system and reclaim it and say, this is mine. And then, as white people in America, they wouldn't step out so violently against other cultures. And because they wouldn't, their appropriation, I really do believe, is not out of malice, right? And I really believe that it is in a searching of their own. And it's like, why can't we share? Because sharing implies you have something to offer me, right? Like, if you don't have a culture, if you don't have practice, if you don't have language, what exactly are you exchanging in this supposed sharing situation? You're not sharing, you're taking.
That's right.
And that is that energetic colonizer thing that keeps repeating. I'm going to just keep taking and hoarding and hoarding. And ancestral healing releases that. You want to know, so then you could share. It's different, right? Like you said, you're Italian American. That was a great share. Well, let me tell you what we do in like a hoodoo practice or in a Celtic magic practice. That's an exchange of culture. Me telling you, hey, well, this is what I do with my okra, and then you going to do it with your okra. It's colonizing. It's appropriation. We didn't share.
Right.
We didn't exchange.
unless I have something from my genuine culture that I can share with you. And that's something that I'm still in the process of reclaiming because of
Good.
that whitewashing. Like, but I, have invested quite a bit of energy in reclaiming that, like I could, there's quite a few not nice recipes, very nice recipes I could share with you about family heritage recipes, like piatta forte, for example, where
Oh, I want to know about that.
okay, so this is like, okay, layers of chocolate and vanilla pudding with like some kind of a cake that's dipped in liqueur, your choice of liqueur. If I were to make it now, I would dip it in my honey mead, some kind of herbal, probably
Ooh.
the customary honey mead that I make, and dip the cake in that, and then layer it between these layers of chocolate vanilla pudding. And then you get
Nice.
to the top and you put some kind of like whipped cream topping. If I were to make, I'd be making this vegan right now, right? So it would be maybe with some eggs, like some homegrown eggs, but
Nice.
but regular, but like nut milk, or for the pudding. And then maybe like a coconut cream topping with some slivered almonds on top. And then that's like a midwinter solstice celebration.
That sounds like a really decadent tiramisu, and I'm
Yeah.
totally down.
So because
Because that sounded absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely amazing, right?
yeah.
And like something like that would be a beautiful thing to place on your altar, right? Like if you were having an ancestral altar, and I tell people you could start with something so small, because some people are so confused. You kind of mentioned it. What about if my ancestry? I don't know these people. It's been so long. We've been here since the Mayflower. Start with something small, and people are often concerned about problematic ancestors. And it's like, first of all, at least in my belief, not every person that has died is your ancestral guide,
Yes.
right? Like that's just too crowded. That's just like,
Mhm.
your ancestral guide are those that like were the wise ones that were doing the work here anyway. And then when they left from this manifestation of their energetic bodies, they just became another energetic being, another energetic situation around you, right? And when you give them veneration in that way, right? Because that would be similar to like, like I have my own ancestor altar, and I will do like a honey cinnamon sort of mixture on top of a cake, and I will offer it. And that's my, here you go, and this is for the sweetness of life and all of this. Or I would think it reminds me of like, we just are coming out of Shanatova, right, for the Jewish holiday. And they do that with the sweet breads and pomegranate and all of that. And for a sweet year, that is a beautiful tradition that's passed on. Those are things that you share, right? I learned that not because I wanted to go take over Jewish appropriate Jewish culture. I learned that because a friend of mine invited me into their home and exchanged that culture with me. Muchly, greatly appreciate it, like you have. And then when you start seeing all these intersections, right? And like, oh, well, wait, we do that, and you do that, and I do that. We start recognizing that we are much more alike in our indigenous practices of who we are. And religion was the first great separator, because that's man-made, that's created. Religion is a system, like you call it, a socio-political system. And then color line was amplified to continue to push out the message of supremacy, right? But when you're down to, like you said, like these beautiful sacred practices, what's something is so simple, and when you're offering that to your ancestors, they want to come and show up for you and guide you more. So for you, I would tell you, get you a little white altar cloth or something simple, candle, glass of water, and place that. I don't want to say it wrong, but I think you said piatta forte.
Yes, piatta forte, strong plate.
Okay, and you place that there at your ancestors and thank them. Thank them for you having that knowledge. That is a gift. That was something that wasn't stripped from you. Even that simple. Like I said with the okra, if it's the only thing that I know of the people that I come from that were taken and captured and enslaved in Africa, I will hold on to it
Mm,
sacredly.
mm,
And I will ensure that every single time we plant okra, I tell that story to my children.
mm.
And that when we eat okra, it is sacred because of the struggle just to get it here. And there's plenty more crops like that. But just explaining to people how something so simple, how something, one thing can open up the gate of deep ancestral epigenetic healing
Mm.
and shifting that colonized mindset to wanting to break from this. Because the deeper you go into that healing, the more you realize this system is created for no one.
Mm.
No
Except,
one.
except that,
Everyone is oppressed.
right. And that's except that wealthy elite that already has it set up. I kind of feel that way, similar way that you feel about okra. I feel that way about rosemary.
Ooh, tell me about rosemary.
So rosemary, I'm pretty sure it's a plant that's indigenous to the Mediterranean, to
Oh, I didn't know.
Italy. Yeah. And it was brought here. And it's, I mean, it's a spice that you find in lots of Italian recipes.
Yes.
It grows really well here. And it was one of my first introductions to going out and getting food from the land. My mom would be making Italian, spaghetti sauce on the stove and a big pot of it. And it would have to cook there on the stove all day. And she would ask me to go get a sprig of rosemary from the rosemary bush out
I
there,
love it.
bring it in. She'd put the sprig in there and it would flavor the whole soup. And then she would take the sprig out at a certain point because it's like a whole branch.
Yeah, yeah. I
Yeah,
mean, I have fresh rosemary, so I use it in the same
right.
way, but I love your story.
And so for me, rosemary has that quality, and it's also a really great herb for memory. As I went into herbalism and learned more about herbalism, there's a tradition of making a rosemary sachet and having it in your pillow, in a baby's pillow and in the mom's pillow when the baby is first born, in order to remember those early days of bonding and to
I did that
remember.
with rosemary and lavender.
Oh yeah, and remember your ancestry. Now, I don't know, this is just what I learned from my herbalism teacher, and
I
I
love
don't
that.
I don't know what tradition that came from. Like
I don't know either. And when you said it, that's what I'm like, that's interesting because I love rosemary. I love just the smell of it. And thank you for sharing. I did not know its origin. But I enjoy rosemary. I also dry out my rosemary. And instead of like, see, like even that for you, being that it's an Italian indigenous plant, right? When you're talking about, oh, why can't we use sage or something, not you specifically, like, okay, you just found it's like that simple. Like sage is a plant. This is not rocket science here, right? Like you can grow any plant pretty much anywhere with this new technology, right?
Mhm.
So like you could take your rosemary and I love that you just said it's about memory. So imagine taking your rosemary, drying it out, bundling it up together, and when you're burning and cleansing and clearing your house, you're having those memories of your mother. And who knows what memories she had of Rosemary, right? So you're connected now to that and to the memory of them. And the hands before you that made that pasta, right? Like that crushed those tomatoes and like everything becomes sacred
Mhm.
when you release this system.
Mhm.
Everything. And that was something that our even just last generation, right? At least our grandmothers knew, right? They had the value of taking time, being quiet, being calm. And this system doesn't allow that. It forces it away. And it's so imperative to find the time, whatever that may be, right? Because I recognize some of the things sound like they'll take too much. But just like you said, putting a twig, can we pause?
Mhm.
Okay, you can go. So taking something just as simple, like I said, like the okra. Making an ancestor altar. Nobody's asking somebody to turn over their life entirely, right? Like sell it all. Some people have done that. That's great. If you get that fast and that can happen for you, hey, exponentially get out of the system. But start there. Start with, find an indigenous plant to your people. What did they use it for? What are the medicinal and magical properties? Use it as a burning stick. Use it as an offering on your ancestral altar. Use it to infuse water because water is life and water is here since the beginning of time. Put it in your water. Drink your water. Put it in your water. Drink your water. And it absorb that, right? And cleanse yourself. Like you said, like that menstruation. If you are honoring it, even if they just begun there, right? For someone who bleeds, if you just honored it as not something nasty, but as something sacred that you do, a shedding and a renewal, that in and of itself is a beginning of breaking from the system. And ancestral healing, because it's an ancestral practice.
Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. I want to keep sharing pieces that I can share with you so that you'll keep sharing pieces that you're sharing with us. Oh,
this is wonderful. But this is fair exchange. Like I'm loving this exchange.
Yeah. Well, I'll just share one more, and because you've given so much, I want to give another thing. For me, what's really powerful, another plant that's really powerful is the rose. And it would be interesting to do a little more research about the origins of the rose. And I know that the rose plant has grown all over the world, but to like really do an ancestral lineage tracing project on the rose itself and various varieties of the rose and where they come from. But the rose is definitely connected to the womb reverence lineages. So yeah, and so for me, a practice that I do that I've sort of reclaimed from that connection between the rose and sacred menstrual practices is when I do give my blood back to the earth, like we mentioned earlier, to really nourish the earth, give back to the earth. One of the main ways that I do that is to give it to my rose bushes.
I love that.
And then when we give our blood to specific plants in the garden, we're giving our DNA, we're giving information about our ancestral lineage, about whatever health conditions we have, about our family, about our work, about our emotions, everything that's in that blood, everything that we feel when we bleed goes into that blood. So all of the insights, the divine inspiration, the card readings, the whatever it is that we're feeling, we're giving that to the plant, and particularly the rose. And then the rose in its blossoms gives us customized medicine for whatever ails us.
I receive that and I have nothing else because that is amazing. Well, I would say because my husband will randomly buy like a rose or something if he goes like to the gas station and bring it. So I save it and I'll make rose water, right?
Yeah.
Sprinkle my face, maybe make a rose bath. Sometimes I'll make a rose candle. So I'm going to do that. Now I want a rose bush.
Yes.
Because I would make like rose hips tea or something,
exactly.
right? Like,
well, rose petal tea.
Rose petal. I mean, I meant to say petals. Yes.
And rose hips too. Like if you can, a lot of rose cultivars don't really make rose hips because they were bred to make beautiful blossoms more. If sometimes they will, like I have one of my roses is making one big fat rose hip, right? But there's some varieties that are more like hedge roses and things like that that are closer to the wild rose variety that will make more abundant rose hips. There's so many different varieties of rose.
I'm so excited.
So you can totally go down this rose rabbit hole and have a heyday with roses. And I make rose water to drink as well
Yes.
as to use for cleansing and cleaning and anointing and all of that. I put rose petals. I hesitate to use rose petals from commercially grown roses because they're often sprayed. They're tasty roses.
Right.
Insects and different diseases are very common, especially in commercially grown roses that aren't really getting the nutrients they need and the care that they need, and nobody's giving them their menstrual blood. So they're often treated
Right.
with a lot of chemicals to make them look big and luscious and beautiful anyway, right? So I wouldn't tend, if I had commercial roses, maybe I would use them to offer back to the land in some way. But
Oh yeah, I would never consume it.
no, no,
Yeah,
no,
I did
right,
not. I would
right.
make like the rose water to splash on my face, and more, it's about the energy of which it was given in, not.
Exactly. That's what
I
you're.
love that you shifted it for me. Like, this is actually the energy of the plant. I utilize the rose in the energy in which it was given from my husband to
There you
me.
go. So then you're bathing yourself in
In that love, in his
loving.
thoughts of me, in that
Exactly.
affection. I love that you just gave me, thank you for that. That's such a gift. I love that you just gave me some information to find about using the actual power and lineage of the rose and connecting my own like life energy with its life energy. This is honestly going to be my weekend project of seeing
Yay!
the rose that I need to plant in front of my cottage.
And
Honestly.
I just want to say that I am in full confidence that your husband's love neutralizes any of that, those qualities of the commercial rose that I was
Thank
mentioning,
you.
for sure. But that's also another reason why I like to grow my own roses,
Right.
because I want to have those physical qualities in that relationship, that giving and receiving, that exchange
It's
with the
beautiful.
plant.
Right.
So, and then I have the roses on my ancestral altar as an offering, and I make rose mead, and I make lots of different things, rose ointment, balms.
Oh my gosh, I'm in love with this rose idea now.
Yeah, yeah. So, and that's like a powerful ancestral womb healing thing, and you're inspiring me in this. Like, talking to you about it is inspiring me to deepen that practice by learning more about the ancestral lineage of roses themselves.
Yeah, I'm
Woo!
excited. I'm gonna go down that rabbit hole with you, just to
All
let you
right.
know.
Well, maybe we'll have a follow-up podcast episode at some point to
I'd like
discuss
that.
the rose lineage and ancestral healing with roses and other plants. And just so you know, I've been growing okra. I had okra for breakfast, and the seeds were given to me by a fellow gardener at a community garden scenario where we had a similar exchange relationship. Um,
Beautiful.
and I love learning more about okra, but I just eat it, and then I save. I guess you're drying it to save the seeds. You're not drying it to eat it, right?
Oh no, I'm not trying it to eat it. No,
Okay.
my husband is an okra eater. I am a New Yorker. I did not even know what okra was. Shame on me. Um, so it was not a part of my stews or anything growing up. But my husband loves okra. I
Uh-huh.
am literally I keep it for the seeds and I utilize them as offerings to my ancestors because a good documentary to check out on Netflix is High on the Hog,
High on
and
the.
it High on the Hog. You would really enjoy it. It gives us a lot of the history of the food that sometimes we often think is American or Southern food,
Right.
and how it was actually like even rice was brought over from Africa. Like I was like, what?
Yeah. Well,
Wild.
tomatoes were brought to Italy from the Americas.
Right. Like, yes, I found that out and I was like, wait, tomatoes aren't Italian? How wild is that? That's like,
I
okay.
know.
Wow.
And potatoes as well. Potatoes were brought from the Americas
Right.
initially.
Isn't that like, it's just mind boggling. So when you start learning about all of those things, so I keep it literally just for ancestral offering
Mm,
on my altar to
okay.
say thank you, to remind me of their struggle and that a part of that struggle still is here in the hands, and like that energy that tilled this soil on this land
Mm.
from that land, right? Because you have to think, if they traveled with those seeds, that means that the seeds that are being propagated still, especially if they're heirloom seeds, literally still came. Their origins are
Right.
still from there, from those ancestors that harvested that crop, knowing or not knowing they would never come home again.
Mm.
Tied into their corn braids, right? Like, and this is why, like, when we're talking about appropriation, you see, it's like, oh, well, I could wear these braids. I could. It's deeper than a
Mhm.
hairstyle, my love,
Mhm.
right? Like, my ancestors would stand at the door of no return,
Mm.
never ever. Not even like, oh, their kids would go back. We have never been back. We don't know where to go back to, many of us.
Mm.
And they stood at the door of no return, hair braided with hidden crops in their hair,
Mm.
hidden rice grain, hidden okra seeds. And they came here, and it's survived that boat ride, and it survived the generations of what these people went through.
Mm.
So when I plant it in my garden and when it's offered up on my altar, it is a remembrance of that.
Mm. Well, and I feel like there's a similar, not nearly the same as coming over on the slave ship, but there was similar immigration stories of
Yes.
stitching the seeds into the
Yes.
hem
Oh
of
my
the
gosh. I have
shirt, and
my Jewish friends, it's like, she jokes about, like, well, I'm not going to make the joke because I'm not Jewish, but she jokes, she's like, like, she saves things. She's like, it's from, but it's true. So I'm going to make the joke. She's like, she jokes about, she's like, hey, I know how to keep things and hoard it. And like, because my ancestors used to sew like their jewelry and their diamonds. And
right.
I'm like, actually, yes, like, you're correct. Like, a part of that in you knows how to keep things and understands it is not about the trope that Jewish people are miserly. It is actually genetically encoded in there from what was stripped from them.
Mm-hmm.
And now you kind of come here, and the being of a marginalized group, and being, especially when you're violently marginalized in that type of way, you living is a revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Me existing, my existence shows the resistance of these people.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes hand in hand, right? Like, when you see that Irish women are plumper than the average idea of beautiful white America, right? Like, thin, blonde, blue eyes, but you see them a little bit portlier, a little bit plumpier. That is our genetic coding saying, you need to store this food because there could be forced starvation.
Yeah.
At any point in time, right? Like, our DNA informs us.
Mm-hmm.
Our trauma informs us.
Yeah.
And I had posted on my IG about that, like, pay attention to language. Like, when we talk about inform, right? So you take it and you separate that. Form means to take shape. Think about wombs, right? What happens in a womb? Something gets formed, something takes shape, something becomes something, and then it is birthed. So our trauma informs us, and it passes on, right? Like, those cells remember, like you were talking about, like those little, this cell inside of this cell. And so it literally changes our DNA.
Mm-hmm.
It That's epigenetic healing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we're going to be portlier because we still remember when the Brits came into Ireland and forced a famine and forced starvation on the people.
Mm-hmm.
It's an inner knowing. And when we do ancestral healing, that's what you get back to.
Mm-hmm.
It's knowing why these things are happening in your life. It's an inner knowing, like tapping back in. That makes so much sense.
Mm.
Oh. And then once you start connecting over here, you got to release something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you start recognizing that this is an enemy of you too,
Mm-hmm.
especially for white people. It's not loyal to you because it took from you, it forced you to put all of that beautiful culture down that you had.
Mm-hmm.
Ethnic Europeans had beautiful culture,
Mm.
and it was stripped.
Yeah. Yeah. Chasing after this unattainable thing that was designed really just to enslave us even more and more.
Yes.
So
To
thank you.
continue the agenda of the Roman Catholic Church.
Right. Yeah. And everybody who is using that church for their agenda.
Correct.
So we could keep repeating that.
Yeah, we could.
And over. And I would love to keep exchanging stories and cultural gems with you, but I think probably we'll save more for a part 2 or some other collaborative project that we might do together. Thank you so much, Desiree, for joining me on the podcast and sharing all of your wisdom here. If folks wanted to get in touch with you and learn more about your work, how might they do so?
Well, Jessica, thank you for having me here and giving me this space. They can go to Desiree, DESIREEB Stevens with a ph.com. That website pretty much has everything that I do on there. Everything's being collaborated into that one space. So give it about a week and it will be there. If you need something immediately though, you can go to Selenite, SELENITE, and Sage, SAGE.com, and all of my work is there.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing yourself so generously. And listeners know that if you want to learn more about what's going on at the Womb-Centered Healing Temple, you can go to wombcenteredhealing.com and sign up for the newsletter there on the homepage and receive announcements about upcoming podcast episodes, including this one once it's published, as well as blogs and upcoming courses and events. So hope to see you all very soon. Thanks so much for joining us. That's all for now. Until next time.